So now to the business at hand. I have the very distinct pleasure of introducing our speaker tonight. James Clifton is director of the Sarah Campbell Blaffer Foundation and has been since 1994. He holds simultaneously the position of curator of Renaissance and Baroque painting at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, where the Blaffer Foundation is also displayed. So if you know anything about the Blaffer Foundation, it has for some years now been sort of renting exhibition space, and it lives within the building but is a discrete entity in its own right. Dr. Clifton received his PhD from Princeton University, which incidentally is where we first met when I was an undergraduate and Jim was a graduate student back in the go-go 80s. It's been such a pleasure to maintain contact with him over the years, and we've benefited enormously from him already, because you'll remember that installation, its first iteration, Van Gogh to Munch, and it included some key loans from the Blaffer Foundation, which really made that installation extremely special. Jim is by training a Renaissance painting specialist, which is why I thought he might provide a very interesting counterpoint on our current view on the Italian masterpieces from Glasgow. And he's published very broadly in his field and curated many, many exhibitions. Most recently a show on an artist whose name I can't pronounce. Maybe he'll do it for me. It's Joachim.
I'll get to it in the lecture.
It's Dutch, which was on view at the National Gallery of Art in DC as well as in Utrecht. So to mention just a few of the many academic articles that Dr. Clifton has published, and to intrigue you just a little, here are a few titles. Hastening to See Christ, Religious Painting in an Age of Conflict, which was published in 2015. The Face of a Fiend, Convulsion, Inversion, and the Horror of the Disempowered Body. That's my favorite title. A Fountain Filled with Blood, Representations of Christ's Blood from the Middle Ages to the 18th Century, which was published in 2001. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Clifton, who will be speaking tonight on the Italianness of Italian art. And if you are of Italian descent, he promises to manage not to offend you.
Thank you, Ike, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me. And I want to thank also Hannah Ashcraft for facilitating, making possible my visit in this lecture, and also my thanks to the Dead Artists Society for sponsoring it, and my thanks to you all for coming this evening. I initially thought that this topic, the Italianness of Italian art, would be an easy one to address, even though Microsoft does not like the term Italianness. It's underlined every time I put it down, but I'm sticking with it. It seems fairly obvious that there's something distinctive about Italian painting that makes it different from, for example, German, Flemish, or Dutch painting or French painting, and it seems to me to make perfect sense to have an exhibition of Italian art as we do here, even one that spans 5 centuries. It seems inherent, it seems obvious, it seems natural. But in fact, it's not natural at all. The grouping together of pictures like this is historically bound. It was an idea that came up more or less in the Enlightenment when museums started, for example, and there was one had to organize them in a particular way, and so one began organizing them by national schools. So the Italian pictures would be together, and the Dutch pictures would be together, and the French pictures, and so forth. But there are any number of ways one can slice the history of art, and art historians, like historians or anyone else, starts with a giant mass of material and has to figure out some way to organize it in order for it to make sense, to be conveyable, in order to have anything to be able to say about it. And one way that people have done this is to group, for example, Italian pictures together, and we still see that in encyclopedic museums or universal survey museums, as they're sometimes called, like LACMA, for example, where you have the European works together and the Asian works together, and within the European works it's done chronologically, and you have the Italian works together, and so forth. This also was a driving impetus in the formation of the collection of the Glasgow Museums, which were initiated with a bequest to the city by Archangel McClellan in the 1850s upon his death. But he had put together a personal collection, and about half of the works in the exhibition here are from his collection. And he very intentionally did it for didactic purposes, which is interesting because in a certain way it's very much like the Sarah Campbell Blaffer Foundation collection, which I oversee, that's meant to be representative of certain places and certain times. And in the bequest in 1853, he said quite clearly, and I'm quoting here, "I had for 30 years spent much of my spare time in making a collection of pictures illustrative of the characteristics and progress of the various schools of painting in Italy, Germany, Spain, the Low Countries, and France since the revival of art in the 15th century." And all of these ideas about that there are these different national schools, and also about the progress of the arts since the 15th century, all of these are ideas which had been initiated sometime in the Renaissance and developed in the Enlightenment and then carried through even to our day. But my topic, as it turns out, proves to be not so simple at all. I really thought I was going to take an easy way out when Ike asked me to give a lecture, and it's something I've been sort of thinking about. But it got more and more muddled, and I think I'm going to introduce more problems and answers, and ultimately I hope just to deflect your attention from the topic altogether. Titian's Head of a Man, which we see here as perhaps a perfect metaphor for the topic and for this lecture. He seems to me also Italian. He's handsome and enigmatic and alluring, as Italians are wont to be, kind of international man of mystery. But he's also, as it happens, and if you've seen the exhibition, you might have noticed, he's also merely a fragment of a much larger painting, which is also here in the exhibition. His identity is unknown, possibly a self-portrait. His relationship to the story in the larger picture is unknown. He is incomplete in himself and probably an unresolvable puzzle, again, like this lecture. I began thinking about this topic actually when I first came across a book by Giovanni della Loggia called L'Identità Italiana, or Italian Identity, which was published in 1998. And it was an introductory overview of a series which was to have volumes of more specific aspects of Italian culture and identity, including various Italian authors, famous authors like Petrarch and Dante and so forth, but also topics like fascism and communism, la pasta e la pizza was a single topic, and la mamma was another topic. And all of these things were thought to be particularly characteristic of Italians. And the concept has come to be called Italianità, that is to say, Italianity. It's such a vexed and problematic idea, and I sometimes wonder if one could speak also of the inanity of Italianity. I've stuck with Italianness, it's a somewhat less disturbing term. The necessarily resulting generalizations in trying to identify some specific characteristics, these generalizations or even stereotypes make the project of identifying these things open to considerable criticism, which has been forthcoming in response to that book and that series. But posing such a question as what it means to be Italian, to my mind, can be marvelously thought-provoking, even if we can't necessarily resolve it. Most people in Europe and the United States and many elsewhere have some generalizing concept of Italy and Italians, whether it's born of direct personal experience or mediated through popular culture, like watching the Godfather films, especially watching the third one, which would give you a really sour notion of certain Italians. My own personally first and most extended experience in Italy, living in Naples while working on my dissertation many years ago, was a rather shocking one. There was a culture shock, yet there was also something more literal. I had thought about studying German art, but I'd already spent some time in Germany, which was very cold, and so I decided I wanted to go someplace warmer. So I went to Italy. As it happened, the year that I was there was one of the coldest winters on record. And I lived in this really dumpy apartment with some other guys which had no real heating. We had some little space heaters, and at a certain point in the winter the hot water heater broke. And the landlord wasn't particularly responsive to that, but the most interesting thing that happened is that someone in the building, in an attempt to cheat the electric company, attempted to bypass the electric meter and got the, so we've understood later, got the electricity into the water supply. And I was the one in our apartment who discovered this. I went to the kitchen tap to turn on the cold water, which is all we had, and I put my hand on the tap and my arm went numb. So I took it off and I got my feeling back. And I thought, well, that's pretty cool, I'll try it again. I mean, it was sort of an experiment to make sure that that's what had happened. And so every time we would touch it, my arm would go. And, calling the landlord, calling whatever, the sort of utility entities are in Naples, completely useless at the time. And so we learned to live with it. We realized that if we wore tennis shoes all the time, and so we could no longer get in the shower. And of course, they didn't really have shower. I mean, this is one of the things I really never understood about Italy, why they had these kind of bathtub shower things with handheld showers and no curtains or doors. It's like the goal is to spray the entire bathroom with water. But it worked out all right. We discovered that if we wore tennis shoes, we could kind of take a sponge bath. And so I was doing that one day. I was standing there in my birthday suit with my tennis shoes on and washing my hair. So I was leaning over the tub, and the drain got a little bit clogged, and so I'm holding the shower head, and instinctively, without thinking, I reached down to unclog the drain. And the moment that the tip of my finger touched the surface of the water, I experienced the most terrific jolt that I've ever had. And I screamed and threw the thing up in the air. And I decided I was going to move out. And when I told the landlord, he was really upset and dismayed, as if this is some kind of personal affront. And I ended up moving in with this elderly Italian woman and her brother. Everyone in Naples was either a brother or a cousin of Cugino, some sort of or another. And she fed me 3 meals a day and was very mothering and smothering la mama, as it were. And I ate a lot of pastries and slept a lot, and I don't know how I got my dissertation done. All of which really doesn't have much point, except to suggest that everybody has a personal experience of what Italy is like, and mine is somewhat peculiar. In any case, I won't address the ideas about Italianness in Della Loca's book directly. I wish only to address a related question from the narrower field of art, which is there an identifiable Italianness of Italian art, or if you will, an artistic Italianità. One of the things that got me thinking about this actually is not related to Italy, but rather to England. And I'm showing here on the left Lincoln Cathedral, which is from the 13th century, and a painting, 18th century painting by Sir Joshua Reynolds, Lady Sarah Bunbury sacrificing to the Graces. And these come from a significant book by an important art historian, German, who fled National Socialism and ended up working in the United States, Nicholas Pesner, or rather worked in England. And he wrote this book called The Englishness of English Art in 1955. It had been a series of lectures. And I'm quoting him here. He says, "The question asked by a geography of art, an interesting term, as opposed to a history of art, is what all works of art and architecture of one people have in common, at whatever time they may have been made," so these several centuries apart in different media. And he goes on to say that means that the subject of a geography of art is national character as it expresses itself in art. So the question is, does national character express itself in art? Another question is there such a thing as a national character? He had his own objections. Is it desirable to stress a national point of view? There are reasons for that. I'll allude to in a moment. And also, he asks, is there such a thing at all as a fixed or almost fixed national character? That is to say, that something that doesn't change over time. His particular answers aren't relevant here, but our questions, I think, are comparable. And as vexed as the project may be with Englishness, it's even more complicated, it seems to me, with Italianness. And if we look, for example, at a monument that some of you might know, one of the most extraordinary things in Rome, we're just seeing part of it here, John Lorenzo Bernini's ensemble of the St. Teresa in Ecstasy in the Cornaro Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria della Vittoria. We can ask ourselves what this really might have to do with a painting like the beautiful Giovanni Bellini that's in the exhibition here, The Virgin and Child, from about 1480, so about a century and a half before the Bernini. There are two main reasons for the difficulty in identifying an artistic Italianness, it seems to me. Whereas England is insular, historically as well as geographically rather separate from the rest of the world, Italy has historically been at the crossroads of Europe and the Mediterranean, hosting, whether willingly or not, hordes of visitors, whether friendly or not, for centuries upon centuries. So that's one difference. And the other is that unlike England and most of the other states in Europe, Italy was belatedly unified politically, not until the middle or even the second half of the 19th century, and some say actually that Italy was never really unified until the country won the World Cup in 1982. So really does it make any sense to try to discern some Italianness of Italian art? I could just say no and stop here, but keep going. What we're looking at here is a painting on the left in the Louvre in Paris by Roger van der Weyden, The Annunciation, from about 1440. And the same subject by Sandro Botticelli, not entirely a fair comparison because it's about a half a century later, from about 1490, but a painting, a beautiful painting that is here in the exhibition. There are differences, to be sure, between the art of Italy and the art of other places, and the contrast that is most often drawn is generally between Italy and what lies beyond the Alps, particularly Germany or Flanders, the Netherlands in this instance. Europeans were very well aware of them in the Renaissance. They would refer, those north of the Alps would refer to themselves as Deutsch, and those below the Alps in Italy as Welsh. So they had the sense of these broad distinctions. And we can see stylistically, even though they're obviously comparable points, that there are a considerable number of differences. And I'm not going to go into all of them. It's actually a little bit difficult for me to see from this angle. The subject, as I said, is the same, and you have the angel Gabriel more often than not coming in from the left side and talking to the Virgin Mary and describing to her that she is going to give birth to a child, even though she has never known a man, which she finds naturally alarming, and she shrinks from the idea, but then also accepts willingly that she will be the handmaid of the Lord, as it were. The way that the artist represents this subject is very different. The Italian picture is relatively spare in its details, and this is a broad distinction that is often drawn, whereas the Flemish picture, Roger van der Weyden, gives a lot of attention to the details of objects, of surfaces, of stuffs, of things in the ambience, and this has been called an art of describing, northern art, whereas in Italy it's thought of as more of an art of narrative, that the emphasis is on the human figures and the actions of the human figures. Another obvious difference is the distinction in the use of one-point perspective here, rather extraordinarily in the Botticelli, it seems to me, a kind of mathematical way of creating space, a three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface that was developed in Italy in the first half of the 15th century, and in the Netherlands only much later, and only in response to what was happening in Italy. There is a kind of creation of three-dimensional space, but it's done sort of optically and without the mathematical sort of elements that are done in the Italian picture. This could become quite exaggerated. I'm not going to show you an example of work by Paolo Uccello, for example, who was famous for this, and he was described by Giorgio Vasari, who I'll refer to in a number of instances, who was an important writer in the 16th century, in the mid-16th century, on Italian art. He wrote a series of biographies, but also which had kind of overview introductions. He was also a painter and an architect, but more important as a writer, the sort of grandfather of art history. And he wrote about Uccello. Paolo Uccello was an earlier contemporary of Botticelli, who was just so taken with perspective that it became his mistress, as it were, and he paid little attention to his wife. And Vasari said that Uccello's wife told people that Paolo used to stay up all night in his study, and I'm quoting here, trying to work out the vanishing points of his perspective, and that when she called him to come to bed, he would say, "Oh, what a lovely thing this perspective is." So that's something that's quite typical of Italian pictures, and at least in the 15th century, less so of Netherlandish pictures. But one can go through a similar exercise with 16th century paintings and 17th century paintings as well, and come up with a similar set of distinctions between them. The Italian art world of the Renaissance and the early modern epoch was notoriously self-centered, and its self-centeredness was encouraged by all of Europe, which looked to Italy for guidance in matters of art. And a consequent judgment from the Italian point of view was that other peoples were aesthetically less knowledgeable, a judgment that seems to have been particularly applied to the Netherlands, Spain, and Portugal. And as the great Italian sculptor John Lorenzo Bernini, whose work we just saw, was reported to have said bluntly in 1665, and I'm quoting here, "Spaniards have no taste or knowledge of the arts." And this is typical of what we hear from Italians, and we hear it also from Michelangelo, who, according to the Portuguese painter Francisco de Holanda, around 1540, said, and pardon me if I read something that you can read yourself, "We give the name of Italian painting to all good and right painting. And because Italy produces more masterly works of splendid painting and more nobly than any other region, we call good painting Italian." He tries to modify it and to say it's this divine gift, but he ends up going back to Italy. "For this most noble science belongs to no country. It came down from heaven, yet from of old it has always remained in our Italy more than in any other kingdom." And so I think it will to the end. I think if he had lingered into the 18th and 19th century, he would have discovered that that wasn't entirely the case, and most people in Europe wouldn't have agreed with him. Nonetheless, northern painting was appreciated in Italy already in the 15th century. Even the Italians accounted Jan van Eyck and Roger van der Weyden among the best painters in Europe. There were high-quality Netherlandish paintings that made their way to Italy, such as a Jan van Eyck St. Jerome, which was owned by Lorenzo de' Medici in Florence, which may or may not be the painting that I'm showing you here, which is now in Detroit. This is actually a very small, very beautiful picture, and so you get a very distorted view of it on the screen. Most of the salient qualities of northern painting are already evident in the 15th century and were recognized as such by Italians, and I'm alluding to some of them with Roger van der Weyden, and you can see them here, the fineness in handling, a sensitivity to surfaces and textures, a richness of details, and this great attention that is lavished on objects and the things in a space. And even in a historical narrative like the Entombment by Roger van der Weyden from about 1450, which is a picture which was sent to Italy immediately and is now in the Uffizi in Florence, even in a narrative historical subject like this, you can see that the artist lingers on these details of objects and the flora, for example, in the landscape and in the background, the textures of the cloths. You can see even in fairly small details here, for example, the richness of the surfaces. And a Medici agent by the name of Ciriaco d'Ancona, who was an antiquarian as well, made conventional yet telling remarks about this painting already in the middle of the 15th century, asserting that the figures seem to breathe as if they are alive, and that the many objects of different colors and textures, the fabrics, the flora, the architecture, the jewels, are reproduced so realistically that they seem to be the work not of a human, but of nature itself. These qualities were appreciated through the 17th century as well by many Italians, but not by all Italians. And not surprisingly, Michelangelo is perhaps the best example of this. And I show by way of contrast, I've just put the Roger Vanderbilt at the bottom, and Michelangelo's painting of the temptation and the expulsion from the Garden of Eden from the Sistine Chapel. To be sure, these are wildly different contexts. Michelangelo's painting a fresco on a ceiling which is high above the head of anyone who comes into the chapel. Nonetheless, this is fairly typical of Michelangelo in the sense that he is interested solely in the narrative. He is interested in the humans and their consequential actions. Important people doing important things, as Aristotle said of tragedy, which is something that was well known in the Renaissance. But if you think about it, it's almost alarmingly spare, strangely spare, this image, because the Adam and Eve here are being tempted in the Garden of Eden, and then they're expelled from the Garden of Eden. So this is outside the Garden of Eden, and this is inside the Garden of Eden. And so if there hadn't been the fall, they could have stayed inside with these rocks. After the fall, they go outside where there are no rocks. Michelangelo really had no interest in this kind of physical context. He was really interested in the human emotions and expression and actions. Another hallmark of Northern painting was thought to be intense emotion. And Michelangelo, again, was pointedly negative about painting in the Netherlands in this regard. And we can go back to this picture, and I'll read again what Michelangelo is supposed to have said. Flemish painting will satisfy generally a devout person more than any painting from Italy, which will never cause him to shed a tear, whereas that of Flanders will cause him to shed many. And that not through the vigor and merit of the painting, but due to the goodness of the devout person. It will appeal to women, there's a little misogynistic here, especially to the very old and the very young, and also to monks and nuns, and certain noblemen who have no sense of true harmony. In Flanders, they paint with a view to external exactness, and here he's basically saying the same thing that others have said, but with this sort of specific negative connotations. They paint with a view to external exactness, or such things as may cheer you and which you cannot disparage. They paint clothes, masonry, the green grass of the fields, the shadow of the trees, and landscape, with many figures on this side and many figures on that, as if, he says, I mean, he doesn't say this, but you're inferring as if, why would anybody want to paint that sort of thing? Because it's really not very interesting. And he goes on to say, and all of this, though it pleases some persons, is done without reason or art, without symmetry or proportion, without selective choice or boldness, and finally with substance or vigor. And so this art is, as Michelangelo conceives it, is something that is intellectual, it is rational. It is about the activity of the mind and not the eyes reproducing some external reality. Now, to be sure, the person who reported this, supposedly reported this, Francisco de Holanda, this Portuguese painter, had his own agenda, and the comments shouldn't be taken as unmediated expressions of Michelangelo's viewpoint. But the distinction they draw between the naturalism of depicted objects in Northern painting as a putatively more rational and even intellectual foundation in Italian art is consistent with much of the writing on art, and not just Italian writing. In a provocative and influential book published in 1983, Svetlana Alpers summarized the broad differences between Northern art and Italian art by characterizing Northern art, as I've suggested, following her, as an art of describing, and Italian art as a narrative art, that is, distinguishing between an emphasis on the depiction of things and on the depiction of human actions. But there are always caveats and exceptions that tend to render such generalizations nearly unusable. In a recent book, Thomas da Costa Kaufmann has traced the history of writing on what we can call a geography of art, what Nicholas Pessner called the geography of art. The idea that the art in particular places is somehow unified, even across centuries, thus justifying its division and segregation into schools, whether in art history books or museum exhibitions, as here. And he identified two key concepts which have persisted since at least the 18th century, if not earlier, and they can be summarized with the phrase blood and soil, or as some Germans who wrote about the topic would say, Blut und Boden. The first of these, blood, suggests an ethnic or racial essentialism. That is, cultural products differ because the people who make them are of different races. Vague concepts like the spirit of a people, the Volksgeist, are invented. And it's a short step, it seems to me, within this idea to a qualitative judgment that the cultural products, artworks of one race are better than those of another race because the race itself is better. This idea was embraced by Nazi historians and some sympathizers and is obviously highly problematic. The second of these concepts, soil, suggests an environmental determinism. That is, the climate itself affects cultural products. It was asserted in the 18th century that the ancient Greeks produced such excellent sculptures of the human body because the weather was always warm and the artists were able to observe constantly near naked and very buff bodies, learning about the Greek islands, as they still do. I've never been there, so. The Swedish architect and writer Carl August Ehrensvärd, also in the 18th century, wrote that the closer one got to Italy, especially Naples, the more beautiful both art and people are. The northern climate, he said, made people uglier, and they could make only ugly things. Looking at the Madonna and Child from the exhibition here by the Neapolitan Francesco Solimena, I might not be inclined to argue with his thesis. It's a very beautiful painting, a very beautiful woman and a very charming child. But I tend to think that it has more to do with professional practices, guilds throughout Europe that were resistant to the intrusion of artists coming from other places, trying to get into their market, into their business, and also workshops in which pupils learned from the master and then passed on what they learned to their own pupils, generally locally. And in such systems, change comes only very slowly and within fairly narrow parameters. So we could look, for example, at the Giovanni Bellini Virgin and Child from about 1480 to 85 that is here in the exhibition, and we see that there's a certain type here which is specific to Bellini and his workshop, that is to say, the Virgin holding the child at half length in front of a parapet. It seems not remarkable to us, in fact, but in fact it was fairly persistent in Bellini's art and his studio. And so if we look at the painting by Genzo Catina, which is also here in the exhibition, and I have to point out that what's missing here at the bottom of the slide is a parapet that you can see in the painting in the exhibition, but the slide has cut it off. We will recognize Catina as a pupil of Bellini, even though he has his own personal style. He's doing the same kinds of pictures. In fact, this particular picture of the Virgin and Child with the two female saints derives more directly from another painting by Bellini, and Catina made these kinds of pictures as well. So we could see how artists working in the same place with a master, reproducing the same kinds of pictures, learning to paint the same way the master paints. We can attribute this to a workshop practice rather than to any notion of blood and soil. There's nothing that's particularly racial or ethnic or having to do with the climate that creates this sort of connection between these two pictures. Other artists can try to come in, and I'm not suggesting that there aren't differences. The great German painter Albrecht Dürer, painter and printmaker, made two trips to Italy. And in the first, in the 1490s, he visited Giovanni Bellini's studio, and afterwards he painted a picture which is now in the National Gallery in Washington, the so-called Haller Madonna. And it's clear that he has adapted Giovanni Bellini's composition. And yet it doesn't really quite look the same, does it? The emergent, particularly the child, is a really different creature altogether. And I don't mean just from Bellini's painting, but just sort of creature altogether. And he's introduced a number of other elements that are perhaps more typical of northern painters than of the Italians. Occasionally, the painters like Bellini would have a window open into the background and there would be a landscape. It wouldn't be as precisely painted as that. There's more of a tendency to put objects on the parapet in front and so forth. And so there is this kind of connection, and yet at the same time we can see that there is a difference. Giorgio Vasari, again this 16th century writer, he published his first biographies in 1550 and then an expanded version in 1568. Talked quite a bit about Dürer, who was famous in Italy, and he said that the artist Dürer sought, and I'm quoting here, to draw near to the Italian style. That Dürer wanted to learn how to paint like an Italian. He was attracted to it. Vasari says, the Italian style, which he always held in high account. In truth, if this man, so able, so diligent, and so versatile, had had Tuscany for his country, and had been able to study the treasures of Rome, he would have been the best painter of our land. So he's not saying that if he had been an Italian, if his blood were Italian, he would have been a better painter, but rather if he had been trained in Tuscany, if he had seen the glories of Rome that these other painters had seen. Dürer later claimed that Giovanni Bellini had praised him and asked for a painting by his hand. So there was a kind of mutual admiration and the distinction between these artists. As we see it, his painting doesn't quite look the same because Dürer had his own training. He was a mature artist by the time he came to Italy. Complicating the opposition between Northern and Italian art is the fact that neither could ever remain pure anyway, and we see this travel of Dürer across the Alps. Both artworks and artists travel both ways across the Alps, necessarily contaminating the supposed purity of each culture. And we've already looked at paintings by Jan van Eyck and Roger van der Weyden, and here Albrecht Dürer. Perhaps most important for Florence is the great altarpiece now on the Uffizi in Florence by the Flemish painter Hugo van der Goes, which was painted in the middle of the 1470s. This Adoration of the Shepherds triptych, which was commissioned and sent to Florence by an Italian merchant, Tommaso Portinari, who was living in Bruges at the time. He was the manager of the Bruges branch of the Medici Bank. And we can make a classic comparison between this picture, which is consistent with what I've described, what is generally described about Netherlandish painting. Even though it's a biblical subject, it is filled with lots of fascinating details and an attention to fabrics and surfaces and so forth. And it had an impact in Italy, and this is a sort of classic comparison between the Portinari altarpiece on the bottom, the Hugo van der Goes, and above a painting that was executed very soon after the arrival of the Portinari altarpiece in Florence, an altarpiece in the Sassetti Chapel in the Church of Santa Trinita by Domenico Ghirlandaio in 1485. The same subject, an adoration of the shepherds. Shepherds don't look quite as rough. They're somewhat more idealized in the Italian picture, which is also typical. There is this attention to details in the picture that in part is from the impact of this, I think, and yet it ends up looking very different. What he has included that the Netherlandish artist wouldn't are classical details. For example, the crib becomes, or the manger of it becomes this classical sarcophagus. There's classical triumphal arch in the background. These are the actual pilasters of the chapel in which the altar in which the altarpiece is set, and he has evoked those as well within the painting. And so this is essentially an Italianized version, classicized version, if you will, of this Netherlandish picture. Nonetheless, there is this impact of the art in one direction or the other. And as I suggested with Dürer, Hugo van der Goes' painting was just sent, but from Dürer's time on, artists from the north began coming to Italy. This trickle that made their way to Italy in the 15th century gradually increased through the 16th century and became a veritable flood in the 17th century. I'm showing you here a self-portrait by Marc van Heemskerk a Dutch painter of self-portrait with the Colosseum, as you can recognize from 1553, which is in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, just by way of example. They came to Italy to see classical and contemporary, that is to say Renaissance art. Some had little effect on the local culture, and Van Heemskerk would be an example of that. He saw the things, he did lots of drawings of classical statuary and architectural motifs, and then he went back to the Netherlands. But others insinuated themselves into the art system and had a profound effect. And Dürer was actually one of those, not so much through his paintings or even his presence there, but through his prints, which were spread all over Europe. He was famous throughout Europe because of his prints. And this included Italy as well. They were a revelation to the Italians and Italian printmakers. One of the artists who copied them a great deal, and actually Dürer ended up having to sue him in Venice, was Marcantonio Raimondi, who was a printmaker who did works after Raphael as well, even though Dürer and Raphael seemed like very different artists. So his prints, like this woodcut of Christ before Herod from 1509, were much imitated in Italy. Even to the point, from Giorgio Vasari's perspective, that it was damaging to Italian art, and he makes a specific comparison between this Dürer's prints and this painting, much ruined, unfortunately, fresco by Jacopo Pontormo from about 1525, which is in the cloister of the Certosa di Galuzzo, and it's part of a series of Christ's Passion. And Pontormo was well aware of Dürer's work. I think you can see these elongated figures of Christ that he's taken from him, and these gestures of the hands outstretched, but also this very crowded space with Pontormo's work that suggests this kind of northern impact. Also, these works end up, from Vasari's perspective anyway, being kind of labored. And Vasari faulted Pontormo for imitating Dürer in everything, so much so that the Christ before Pilate, this fresco here, he says, could be mistaken for the work of an oltremontano, that is to say, someone from the other side of the Alps. And according to Vasari, Pontormo imitated Dürer's style so much that, and I'm quoting here, the gracefulness, the vaghezza of Pontormo's first style was altered by that new study and labor, and was so much damaged, offended is the word he uses, ophesa, so much damaged by coming upon that German style that in these works, however beautiful they all were, little of that goodness and grace that he had once imparted to all his figures is recognizable. And so Vasari is concerned that the impact of Dürer is ruining Pontormo's art. Some artists from north of the Alps gained international renown under the aegis of the Medici in Florence in particular. And foremost among them was the Flemish sculptor Jean Boulogne, or Jean Boulogne, as he was originally named. He came and spent almost his entire career in Florence, rising to the position of court sculptor, and this happens with a number of artists who then Italianized their names. And we're looking here at a couple of large-scale sculptures. He did small-scale bronzes as well, but a couple of large-scale sculptures that some of you might recognize from the Loggia dei Lanzi in Florence. These are public sculptures out of doors. The Rape of the Sabine Woman on the left, and Hercules and the Centaur on the right. And a work, by the way, which I used in an essay that Ike mentioned, which had a lot to do with upside-down figures. And so I was very keen on this twisted and upside-down figure. And we'll see an example of upside-down figures. Remember to note them in a few minutes. Another artist who spent a lot of time at the Medici court was the Flemish painter and draftsman Johannes Stradanos, or Jan van der Straat. And he produced frescoes, oil paintings, and the designs for numerous tapestries and prints for the Medici. Here is an alchemist's laboratory for the studio of Francesco I, who was the Grand Duke of Tuscany. And I bring this in part just to notice the inscription here. It has the date and his name, Johannes Stradanos, but it also says that he is from Flanders. He was buried in in Florence, and his there's an epitaph for him in the church of Santissima Annunziata, which I'm showing here on the right. And as with the painting, the epitaph both here and here says that he is a painter from Flanders, from Bruges. And so there was, even though he spent most of his career there, there is this persistent acknowledgement that he is from someplace else. And he's a different kind of artist, and yet he has had an impact on Florentine art, but also maintained connections with the North. And so the prints that were made after his work were made in the North, even though they might, as the case in several instances, be dedicated to the Medici. So because of him, there are these connections between the North and the South. The Dutch artist and biographer Carl van Mander lamented in 1604 that the beautiful city of Florence, as he called it, enticed and retains for her own enrichment pearls from our Netherlands. That is to say, artists of merit. And so he was concerned that there was this drain on Netherlandish artists to Italy. The Medici engagement with northern artists went far beyond employing them at court, though through their agents already in the 15th century, as with the Portinari altarpiece. Elsewhere in Italy and north of the Alps, they were able to commission works and to acquire works already executed. The Grand Duke Cosimo II acquired important works by the Caravaggesque painter Gerrit van Honthorst, who was then working in Rome and before moving back to the Netherlands. And he himself, Honthorst, had adopted and adapted a style of painting that had been developed by the Italian Caravaggio, and the ramifications within Italian painting of Caravaggio's work we can see in the exhibition. I'm not bringing in the slide, but for example, in the painting by Antoveduto Grammatica, which you can see in the exhibition. And Cosimo also collected small format landscapes on panel and copper by several northern artists, Germans and Netherlandish artists, including Adam Elsheimer, Paul Brill, which I'm showing on the left, and Cornelis van Puylenborg on the right. Both of these are in the Galleria Palatina in Florence in the Pitti Palace. Conversely, Italian art made its way north of the Alps, and this is a famous episode in the history of art. Rembrandt famously said that he didn't need to go to Italy to see great works of art because he could see all he needed to see on the Amsterdam art market. And what we're looking at here is Rembrandt's sketch of a painting that was auctioned in Amsterdam, Raphael's portrait of Baldassare Castiglione, which is now in the Louvre in Paris. And Archibald McClellan, who was largely responsible for the creation of the Glasgow Museums collection, might have thought the same thing. He never left Britain himself. All these Netherlandish pictures and Italian pictures and Spanish pictures that he, French pictures that he collected, he all bought on the art market in Britain. So there's this, even into the 18th century and the 19th century, and of course even now, there's a flow of Italian pictures out of the country. For another work in the exhibition, Andrea Casali's Triumph of Galatea from about 1740 to 1760, another purchase by Archibald McClellan, we can see that Italian artists were actually working north of the Alps for extended periods of time. There are a lot of them, and I just bring this in because it's in the exhibition, but including in England. Casali was a Roman painter who moved to England in 1740 and worked there for the next 25 years, and he created sort of wonderful frothy confection. History painting is just the sort of thing that English painters had not excelled in. They were sort of famous for what they called at the time face painting, portraiture, and so this sort of thing was very attractive to them. One of the reasons that Casali could flourish in London was that the British had acquired a taste for Italian painting, and quite a few Italian artists beginning early in the 17th century with Orazio Gentileschi and others, but especially in the 18th century, moved to England to pursue their careers there. This is very much related to the phenomenon of the Grand Tour. Northerners, especially the British in the 18th century, traveling to Italy and acquiring many works of art that they then sent back home. and just a brief description of the Grand Tour, indication of it. With the painting that's actually in the Santa Barbara Museum of Art's collection, is not in the exhibition per se, but you can find it in the exhibition of classical sculpture and face painting. Giovanni Paolo Panini's St. Paul preaching on the ruins, and even though it has a historical subject here, the real attraction are these actual Roman ruins, which have been put together in this conglomeration, this capriccio fantasy of antiquity. And then on the right, a painting that's in the Houston Museum's collection, a certain William Fermor, who went on the Grand Tour. He was from Britain, and was painted by Pompeo Battoni, who specialized in painting portraits of these Englishmen who came. The English had a reputation for wildness, and when they visited Italy, there was an Italian saying, "Inglese italianato e diavolo incarnato." The Italianized Englishman is the devil incarnate. Venice, in particular, was attractive to foreign visitors, and I'm showing this wonderful Francesco Guardi view of San Giorgio Maggiore from about 1760, which is in the exhibition here. Venice was in decline in the 18th century. It had been a great merchant power, but much earlier there was a certain decadence of politics and morals, as it was seen. In 1797, after a millennium of independence and relative serenity, the Republic was destroyed by Napoleon's European-wide revolution. But before that, it was really the place to visit. And you can see, and just to show you a little bit better with a couple of the details here, in the boat here, there are a couple of gentlemen. I don't know if they're Italian. They might be locals, but they could just as easily be visiting Englishmen. There's a contrast between the two halves of the picture, as it were, in this regard. These vedute, these view paintings, were kind of souvenirs for a lot of the visitors, or glorified postcards, if you will. And just to bring in one of the 19th century pictures in the exhibition of these poor but to the visitor rather exotic women painted in 1886 by Luigi da Rios overlooking a canal. And this exoticism of Venice remained attractive to visitors through the 19th century. Today, of course, we might think of artists like Turner and Whistler and Sargent and many others who went to Venice because it was such a different place. During Carnival, the days leading up to Ash Wednesday, the most picturesque time in the most picturesque city was often depicted by artists, particularly Pietro Longhi. On the left, we see a tooth puller and one of the kind of quacks that Longhi painted, those selling notions, potions, and lotions of various sorts, if you will, or perfume sellers and fortune tellers and exotic animal shows. And here, tooth pullers. Women of good breeding were to disguise themselves in public during Carnival, although it afforded them little protection against the amorous advances that became particularly intensive during this season. The painting on the right shows the interior of the infamous Bisca, a gambling den closed in 1774 by state inquisitors, where participants were only admitted if they were masked. So this is part of the exotic attraction, if you will. Longhi's pictures were popular throughout Europe, in part because they functioned as a counterpart to these view paintings of Guardi and Canaletto and others. And he managed to capture, I think, the elegance, the mystique, the romance, and even the decadence of 18th century Venice with its fashionable ladies and courtesans and masqueraders and gamblers. One scholar said that Longhi conforms to the popular image held by foreign tourists of an amoral city, seductive yet debauched. Which reminds me a little bit of my high school prom date. One English traveler wrote in 1765, and I'm quoting here, "Young persons who seek for entertainment only in debauchery and exorbitant licentiousness may here in Venice indeed, if not satiate their desires, at least tire themselves." But do the broad distinctions between Northern and Italian art imply unity within Italian art? Do they mean that there aren't fundamental differences within the painting of the peninsula. And thinking about the Italianness of Italian art, I can't help but accentuate more its variety than its unity. As I said, it wasn't unified politically until very late, and the people tended to think of themselves as from their locality within Italy rather than as Italian as such. And Petrarch, for example, is a good indication of this. The 14th century Tuscan poet who referred to Venice as an alter mundus, another world. And so they recognize that there are these differences, certainly. Much to his dismay, John Lorenzo Bernini was often referred to as a Neapolitan because he happened to be born there when his father, also a sculptor, was working there on a project. And as we'll see in a moment, Naples was rather disparaged, rather like other parts of Europe. By the beginning of the 17th century in Italy, they began talking about different schools of Italian painting, Roman, Venetian, Lombard, and Tuscan, these four in particular. And just to give you an example, drawing on a painting in the exhibition, this beautiful work by Bartolomeo Veneto, St. Catherine crowned. He was a Lombard artist. He did a little work in Venice, but was very much working under the impact of Leonardo da Vinci, and we see the Madonna of the Rocks here on the right. He has that same kind of atmospheric approach to his work and his handling of paint, which is very typical of this Lombard school, in part related to the Venetian painting. And one can really distinguish between two broad schools of painting in Italy, that is Central Italian, specifically, especially Florence, but also encompassing Rome. And by way of example, I'm showing Michelangelo's creation of Adam from the Sistine ceiling, and on the other hand, Northern Italian, and especially Venetian. And here at the bottom, I'm showing Titian's Danae, which happens to be now in the Museum of Capodimonte in Naples, which was painted about 1545, Michelangelo's ceiling about 1510. Giorgio Vasari reported that Michelangelo supposedly praised Titian because Titian visited Rome, and this is where he painted the Danae. He did several versions of this, and Michelangelo saw this picture while Titian was working on it. And according to Vasari, Michelangelo said that Titian's coloring and style pleased him very much. But, Vasari goes on to quote Michelangelo, Michelangelo said that it was a shame that in Venice they did not learn to draw well from the beginning. And we can see from a Central Italian perspective, when we look at Venetian painting, there is in fact relatively little emphasis on the structure of bodies, the structure of a composition. They often seem looser, both in composition and in the handling of paint, very much softer. This is the Titian that we have in the exhibition here. I've placed the head more or less where it belongs. We can see a similar kind of comparison here between painting by Paris Bordone, who was a pupil of Titian, and contrasting that to a Central Italian painting, a Florentine painting. We don't know the artist of a little bit later period. The Bordone is from about 1522, and the painting on the left is probably from about 1570. And you're not going to be able to see it very well from the slides, but there's this extraordinary softness to the painting by Paris Bordone, whereas there's a considerable linearity, harder edges to the and a greater structure to the figure in the painting on the left. And part of this has to do with the way that they painted. It was very different in Venice than it was in central Italy, in Florence. And the two paintings by Paris Bordone are exceptional in this regard, in that they're painted on panel. But very often, Central Italian pictures were painted on panel, and Venetian pictures were painted on canvas, in a rough weave of canvas. And I'm showing you here, by way of example, two paintings by Tintoretto, the portrait of a Venetian general on the left from about 1570, and a painting on the right of St. Marc rescuing a Saracen from a shipwreck from the mid-1560s, which is in the Galleria dell'Accademia in Venice, which is a huge picture. My slide on the left is not real good, so you're not going to be able to see it very well from this. But very often the Venetians would paint on this rough weave of canvas rather than the very smooth surfaces that the Florentines were painting on. And you can imagine taking a small brush with paint and drawing a fine line on a smooth surface. It can be done, and this is part of the linearity of Florentine pictures. But if you imagine trying to do that on a rough weave of canvas, what will happen is that the line breaks apart, and it doesn't have the clarity that you get in Central Italian painting, and Tintoretto is perhaps the most extreme example of this kind of painting, the sort of rough and painterly work. Vasari actually wrote about Tintoretto in his second edition of his Lives in 1568. Because he had heard of him and he had seen some of his pictures. And so Vasari said of Tintoretto, he said he is, in the matter of painting, he is swift, resolute, fantastic, and extravagant, none of which, from his perspective, were particularly positive things. And he said he is the most terrific brain that the art of painting has ever produced, which is a positive thing, as may be seen from all his works, which were executed by him in a fashion of his own and contrary to the use of other painters, which is not a good thing. Indeed, Vasari says, he has surpassed even the limits of extravagance with the new and fanciful inventions and the strange vagaries of his intellect, working at haphazard and without design, as if to prove that art is but a jest. This master at times has left as finished works, sketches still so rough that the brush strokes may be seen, done more by chance and vehemence than with judgment and design. And he's appalled, basically, that these pictures are so painterly. And he keeps using this word design, which in Italian disegno means drawing, which was used very thoroughly in Central Italian pictures, but much less so in Venetian pictures. But it also means design, but design as a kind of intellective activity, that the whole picture is calculated ahead of time and very carefully produced, and it's not sort of dashed off as he saw it. This very expressive brushwork of Tintoretto. Another writer averred that Tintoretto painted with a broom. There are, however, certain things that are comparable, and this has to do with the time period, in fact. And one of the things that we refer to as a mannerist style of this period that I think we can see in both of these artists is the elongation of the figure, this attempt to make figures more elegant by lengthening them, also ultimately to make them and put them into more difficult poses to show the abilities of the artist as a virtuoso performance. And just to show you a wonderful example with some upside-down figures in the exhibition from the 1590s by the Cavaliere d'Arpino, this Archangel Michael and the rebel angel. So the Archangel is chasing the rebel angels out of heaven, and they are falling, so they're upside down and not in a good way. And you'll notice this. I was fascinated that this was used in the giant kind of announcement from the museum of the calendar, and you get the whole thing. But just in case this ever happens to you, when you're falling, you just sort of grab onto anything you can. Try to break and you can see these extraordinary twisted figures here, and this one, to my mind, is comparable to a painting by a very famous Dutch artist by the name of Joachim Duval. And I bring this in for personal reasons because the exhibition that I've co-curated is a picture from Kansas City that is now in Utrecht and will be coming to Washington National Gallery. And this is an artist who is working in the Netherlands, and so there is this, again, this sort of international style that retains certain differences, and yet there's a kind of unity to European art at the same time. Now, as I suggested, Neapolitan art was excluded from the canonical 4 schools of Italian Renaissance painting, and Naples was virtually ignored. as an artistic center by Central Italian writers of the 16th and 17th centuries. And from a Central Italian perspective, Neapolitan art must have seemed provincial. But by the middle of the 17th century, Naples was home to a vital and distinctive school of painting that rivaled Rome and surpassed Florence in its quality. And by way of example, I'm showing you this beautiful painting by Francesco Solimena, who's working around the turn of the 18th century. This picture is this lady, a very long career. This is a later picture from about 1720, and it's very distinctive for this particular artist. He's easily recognizable. He uses this red ground to come through in the shadows, creating this sort of dusky appearance to the figures. But in very general terms, Naples was thought by Central Italians of the 16th and 17th centuries to be virtually without culture. Both its patron class and its artists were deemed aesthetically ignorant. And I hasten to point out, though, that Naples was prized for its natural wonders. One Perugian writer, so from the north of Italy, north central Italy, called it the most beautiful city in Italy, if not in the whole world. I'm showing you a painting which was executed in Rome in the 1650s, but by a Neapolitan artist, Salvatore Rosa, one of two very large and fabulous landscapes by Rosa in the exhibition. And Rosa was always thought of as a Neapolitan artist, even when he was working in Rome, and he went to Florence and worked in decades of the 1640s around the Medici court. Central Italians had the same criticism of Neapolitans as they did of the Venetians, and this I'm quoting a 17th century Roman writer. The Neapolitan painters are not much given by their own custom to a long application to drawing, rather giving their hands first to the brushes and the colors, and as they say, to painting. So the emphasis from their perspective on Neapolitan art is the activity of working the brush, not the planning of the picture. And I think we see some of that in Rosa's very typical proto-romantic, as it's sometimes called. It's a problematic phrase, but this very kind of agitated, tumultuous, stormy, if you will, kind of landscape, which is activated by this brushwork. And we can see by contrast how different it is from a Central Italian landscape a few years earlier, but still in the 17th century in Italy. And this is a painting by Domenichino, who was active mostly in Rome, although he went to Naples as well and was essentially chased out of the city, and it's a different story. He sort of despised Neapolitans for other reasons. But this wonderful St. Jerome, which is much smaller than the Rosa, but you can see is very carefully planned. It's an idealized landscape. It's a classicizing landscape. And I don't mean to suggest that Rosa is just dashing something off and hasn't planned this composition, but it doesn't give that effect. And what we're looking at here with the Domenichino is not the kind of natural landscape that this suggests that it is, rather one that is just sort of composed of these coulisses, these sort of stage bits that go back into space very carefully around the figure of St. Jerome. And by way of conclusion, I want to talk about briefly about the encounter between a Neapolitan painter, Luca Giordano, and a Florentine painter, Carlo Dolci. This is the giant vault fresco in the Medici Riccardi Palace that Luca Giordano, a Neapolitan, well-traveled Neapolitan, painted in the mid-1680s in Florence. It's a fabulous allegorical glorification of the Medici dynasty, vast in conception. And Giordano's speed of execution was legendary. It's estimated that during his 50-year career, he and his studio painted some 5,000 pictures, roughly one every 3 or 4 days, earning him the nickname of Luca fa presto. They say Luca does it fast. Also reminds me of my prom date in high school. Giordano had been known to whip out a Madonna and Child in the space of a few minutes. And quite different from that is the artist Carlo Dolci, represented by two very beautiful paintings in the exhibition. I'm showing you the Salome, a mature picture from the 1680s, from exactly the same period in which Giordano was painting the fresco on the right. And there's an anecdote involving these two painters. One of many anecdotes recounting Giordano's speed. In Florence, Giordano came to know Carlo Dolci about this the time they were painting these two pictures. And Dolci, as you can see better in the exhibition than in the slide, was a painter of highly finished and very beautiful images. But he was an artist who frustrated his patrons, who began taking commissions away from him because of the extensive time he spent on each picture. Giordano told him, according to the anecdote, "My Carlino, you're the greatest in the world, but you'll die of hunger through such long work," urging him to be less painstaking in his painting and citing the examples of, not surprisingly, Venetians like Titian and Tintoretto. Once, when the Florentine Grand Duchess Vittoria received several paintings from Giordano, she took the occasion to chastise Dolci for his slowness while praising Giordano for his speed. Even more demoralizing to Dolci, we are told, was his visit to the Galleria Medici Riccardi, which you see here, to see Giordano's ceiling fresco. And I'm quoting here from one of the biographers: "Seeing the Galleria finished with such beauty that is noted by all, the brief time that Luca had worked on it, and the great amount of time he himself, Dolci, had spent in vain, made such a vivid impression on him that he became oppressed by melancholy, so that in a few days the good old man lived no more. Much to the dismay of Luca, who was always saddened by the thought of being the cause of the death of such a virtuous painter." It's, I realize, a bit of a downer to end with the death of a virtuous painter, but so I will. I can't claim to have resolved the question of the Italianness of Italian art, what might make Dolci like Bartolomeo Veneto, for example. In fact, not being able to resolve it, I think I'll let myself wander off the topic on purpose. But for those of you who are, like me, seeking the pleasures of Italian art, I hope that the splendid exhibition of paintings from the Glasgow Museums might at least partially satiate your desires without tiring you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed that fabulous talk. I think, though, that we have probably overrun our time. However, if you would like to come up and speak to our lecture, I'm sure we would welcome your questions or comments. But with that, have a wonderful evening, and I will hope that we all have a redefined understanding of Italianness. Thank you.